Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this evening as part of the Learning Together series as part of Trinity University's Lifelong Learning Initiatives. I'm Geary Reamey. I am a Trinity graduate from the class of 1970. I'm also a professor of law at St. Mary's University School of Law here in San Antonio. Prior to joining the law faculty of St. Mary's University, I practiced law in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for a number of years and also served as the legal advisor for the Irving, Texas Police Department. Throughout my career, I have been involved in police education and police reform initiatives, most recently as part of the American Law Institute's project on principles of the law of policing. Trinity's Office of Alumni Relations has invited me to participate this evening in tonight's webinar panel discussion and to introduce my fellow panelists and act as a moderator for this evening's discussion. It is my distinct pleasure to present my fellow panelists and introduce them to you. United States District Judge Nancy Brazel, who graduated from Trinity in 1991, was originally scheduled to appear this evening on our panel. Unfortunately, an emergency situation has prevented her from joining us. But I'm pleased and excited to introduce in her stead Mr. Marvin Hurst, who has graciously agreed to add his wide-ranging perspectives on this important subject. Mr. Hurst, as many of you know, is an Emmy Award-winning anchor and multimedia journalist for KENS 5 TV. I also almost made you an Oscar-winning journalist, Marvin. So I was trying to upgrade your award, but I am mightily impressed that you have won an Emmy. Marvin is also a Tiger, I'm happy to say, but not a Trinity Tiger. He is a proud graduate of Grambling State University. During his long career, Marvin has worked in Louisiana and Texas, winning Associated Press awards for his reporting. Our third panelist this evening is attorney Michael Gross, a Trinity graduate from the class of 1984. And I am proud to say, a graduate of St. Mary's University School of Law. Mr. Gross is board certified in criminal law and criminal appellate law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. He currently serves as president of the Texas Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. He has extensive trial and appellate experience in high-profile capital murder cases and in white-collar crimes. Tonight, each of us will offer a brief, broad introductory statement on different aspects of the webinar topic. After commenting on those, we will open the floor for audience participation. That's the format. It is our fervent hope that this webinar will be a conversation that is driven by questions from you, our audience members. As those questions for the panel occur to you, please submit them using the Q&A tab on your screen. We're not receiving questions through chat this evening. So remember, submit your questions through the Q&A tab. Let me begin with a few observations that I think will provide some context to the conversation. As I think about the ways in which social justice and criminal justice issues intersect, the first and most obvious thing that comes to my mind is the extraordinary breadth of this topic. Virtually every social justice issue eventually involves, directly or indirectly, the criminal justice system, and vice versa. To illustrate what I mean by this, let me mention just a few statistical points. Now, I promise you, I am not going to throw a lot of numbers at you. And despite my academic upbringing, I have successfully avoided the temptation, although it was a strong one, to create a set of PowerPoint slides with graphs and charts. So here are some numbers I'd like you to think about, just a few. In the 2019 prison population of Texas, approximately 1/3 of the inmates in that year were white, 1/3 were Black, and 1/3 were Hispanic. Now that sounds like pretty even-handed treatment by the criminal justice system, right? Well, it does until you realize that whites accounted for about 42% of the population in Texas that year, and Hispanics comprised about 40%. Black Texans represented only 12% of the state's population, while they made up nearly 1/3 of those people who were imprisoned. Why is this? Are our Black citizens being over-policed? Do social and economic conditions contribute to this overrepresentation? Is this disparity the product of systemic or institutional racism or implicit bias? And what role does educational opportunity play in all of this? Does the criminal justice system impact defendants differently depending on race or depending on income inequality? Well, these are all important and complex questions. I think there's a simple and unfortunately simplistic answer, and that answer is, well, yes. All of those factors and many more contribute to the overrepresentation in the criminal justice system of some segments of our society. But they're not a complete explanation of what's going on here. If we return to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice demographic numbers for a moment, we also see some startling facts. For example, the average IQ of inmates in 2019 was 90.29. And the average educational achievement score was less than 8. Does that suggest that we could reduce incarcerations in this state and presumably in others if we could do a better job of educating our citizens? Or since education and financial security are tied so closely, is it just a matter of ensuring better employment opportunities and more financial security? And I haven't mentioned the reality that the criminal justice system is the first and by far the most important institution for dealing with mental illness in the United States. Is this an important way to address, or an appropriate way to address, what is essentially a health issue? We could, and we should, talk about the hot topic of police reform. If, as Supreme Court Justice Brandeis wrote, our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or for ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. If that's true, should we rethink policing so that our men and women in law enforcement aren't expected to do so many things that they weren't trained to do, don't want to do, and aren't really good at? Our conversation tonight can explore any of these vital issues or ones that I haven't mentioned. Social justice issues and criminal justice issues are intertwined in a devilishly difficult Gordian knot. We won't cut that knot with a single stroke, but conversations like the one this evening can at least begin to pick at it. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Michael Gross to share his perspectives, which are informed in part on what he's witnessed while representing his diverse and often indigent clients and how police handled and mishandled some of their cases. Michael?
Thanks, Professor Reamey. I appreciate it. I thought what I would do tonight for a little bit of introduction is to give everyone an idea of what I've seen in my practice, which has handled quite a bit of death penalty work on capital murders, but also handled other types of offenses like driving while intoxicated, things like that, around the state of Texas. And what I've seen in the interaction between law enforcement and prosecutors, Professor Reamey mentioned systemic. When I think systemic in the criminal justice system, I join together at the hip law enforcement and the prosecution authorities. Here's what I've seen. I have had a client, for instance, just to start off on an easy fact situation, where the client is a 19-year-old Black male driving a vehicle in a part of town that is not a place where white police officer thought he would see 19-year-old Black males driving cars around the part of town. And so my client got pulled over, and usually those of us who get pulled over for a traffic ticket, for instance, the officer will come up to the window, say, "May I see your driver's license and proof of insurance?" And that's how it kind of goes down the road. With this young man, however, the officer directed him to get out of the car. He handcuffed the young man and said, "What are you doing in this part of town?" That's not something that I saw that the officer had learned at the academy. I saw it was something that the officer gleaned from being trained by other officers on the street on how to handle individuals. And this white police officer mishandled this situation completely with this young man whom the officer thought was on the wrong part of town. Because of the officer's aggression in the case with the young man, the judge was not happy with the Fourth Amendment concerns on placing the young man in handcuffs and putting him in a police car while he was running any wants and warrants on that young man. We were able to get that case dismissed by a judge who, fortunately, when you have an impartial judge who views these systemic problems in the criminal justice system, corrected a wrong that was frankly committed by this officer on this occasion. But where it gets much worse, in my opinion, is when the stakes get higher, when people's lives are at stake, and where people have died, especially in capital murder death penalty cases. Let's talk about the Flowers case in Mississippi for just a minute to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. Mr. Flowers in Mississippi, a Black man accused of a capital murder. And the officers worked up the case against Mr. Flowers, and he was tried originally on capital murder where the state sought death. Now, when we talk about systemic issues between law enforcement and prosecutors being joined at the hip, the first 3 times Mr. Flower was tried for capital murder where the state sought death, all 3 times the prosecution improperly struck prospective Black veneer people from the panel. 3 times in a row. And the US Supreme Court overturned that 3 times in a row because the prosecutor did not want Black individuals on that jury because the prosecutor was concerned that Black jurors would not sentence a Black man to death. The 4th and 5th times Mr. Flowers was tried, they were mistrials. The jury couldn't come up with a decision on guilt, innocence. The 6th time that Mr. Flowers was tried, this is over a span of a decade. The 6th time Mr. Flowers was tried, the prosecution exercised 4 challenges peremptorily to get rid of 4 Black people from that jury out of 5 Black people that were on the jury. They just didn't get that lesson in Flowers. And the prosecutor in Flowers, when the Supreme Court overruled it again the 6th time, the prosecutors now said, we're going to try him again for capital murder and seek death again. So, That's the Flowers issue in Mississippi. And here's where the systemic issue really comes down to when the rubber hits the road on death penalty cases. How are prosecutors determining whether or not to seek death against individuals? As we said, Mr. Flowers was a Black male. I have had a capital murder case where there's an apartment complex here in San Antonio, and a Black defendant's white drug dealer resided in that apartment complex. And there was a shooting which resulted in the Black defendant shooting and killing the white drug dealer. The state sought death against that man. He had no priors. He had no history of violence. He had no issues where in the state of Texas, the prosecution wants to try to convince a jury that the defendant who's being sought for death is both a danger to the community, a future danger, and that there's no reason to give him a life sentence instead of a death sentence. What is the prosecution's goal in seeking death against this individual? In other words, the prosecution's office should have a set of diverse individuals who are prosecutors in that office that candidly and without any interest or bias one way or the other, decide those two issues in determining whether or not that individual should be sought for death or if it should be a non-death capital murder case. The reason I give you that example, just in closing, is that a friend of mine represented a white defendant who shot and killed his Black drug dealer in that same apartment complex. Yet the DA's office sought not to seek death against that white defendant. Why? There's no fact difference. You've got someone who's buying drugs from a drug dealer and killing them. The only difference in those cases was my client was Black, a friend of mine's client was white. Separate cases, the same apartment complex. So what Professor Reamey was saying about systemic issues, I completely agree with, and it goes from leadership down. In my opinion, leadership is the DA's office and their line prosecutors that are sending these messages to law enforcement that are percolating down on the street where the law enforcement are putting forward their thoughts with individuals they encounter on the streets. So that was my brief introduction, Professor Reamey, on some things that I've seen in the course of my practice.
Well, thank you, Michael. I think that gives us a lot of food for thought, to borrow a name that we apply to another Trinity program and series. But it really does prompt an awful lot of questions. Perhaps we don't have the answers to a lot of those questions, but you've suggested some of the possible answers to those, and we want to talk about those. Again, let me encourage our audience members. If you hear something that suggests a question to you, please feel free to go ahead and enter your question in the Q&A tab, because we would like very much to be guided by what piques your interest, what it is that you find troubling. And maybe it's something that Michael just said, because certainly there was a lot that was troubling me in what he was describing to us. I'm going to turn now to Marvinhurst, our other panelist. Marvin, you've had a career-long view of social and criminal justice issues and how these two intersect and how justice is and very often isn't achieved in our society. I know that you're more accustomed to asking me questions than I am to asking you questions, but as a law professor, I'll overcome that quickly because I have a lot more questions than I have answers. But I'd really like for you to share with our audience and with Michael and myself some of your views and some of your perspectives on this whole important question that we're exploring tonight.
So thank you so much for inviting me, first of all. I am thoroughly honored to sit in for the honorable judge, and my prayers are with her and her family in whatever emergency situation that is. So I started thinking about this topic immediately, and I thought, you know, I'm very tempted to jump into police reform and officer-involved shootings because That's what, we're doing currently and what's driving, some of the calls for reform. But I said, no, I'm going to step back and I'm going to look at some of the cases that I've covered in the past to offer hopefully some perspective and show society's views and how they feel if a person is worth something, then how their views differ on that person. I'm going to go from the perspective of two victims and a suspect. The first person is Cecil Collins. I was at the ABC affiliate in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was playing football out of Leesville. He was Mr. Football. He was a running back. But according to police, Cecil had a problem with breaking into multiple dwellings. So after breaking into multiple dwellings, he got probation. Not only did he get probation for committing what is a felony, he then went on to, they dismissed him from the LSU team. He went on to McNeese State, so he got another chance. So he fails the drug test there. And then he goes on to get drafted by the Miami Dolphins. So he goes to Miami and he's playing for the Dolphins. And guess what he does in Miami? He breaks into a woman's home. The same pattern that he had committed in Baton Rouge. The very same pattern. Now, while in these homes, it was certainly rumored at LSU during that time as I was covering this story, that there may have been some touchy-feely action, but that was never a part of the charge. Nor was that a part of the charge in Miami. But to break into someone's house, a woman's home, and stand over them and look at them, it just feels like one of those stage crimes, like what's next, like there's a buildup. But Cecil Collins was a gift to football. He also became his own enemy. But I believe in my reporting, because of how society viewed him, because he was a product, because he had promise, because he had potential, he was given a break, many breaks. So then I think about Clyde Charles. Clyde Charles was hitchhiking at 4:30 a.m. in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And somewhere across town, there was a white nurse whose car had broken down on the railroad tracks. And all of a sudden, a Black man grabs her and he chokes her, he beats her, and he does the unthinkable to her, right? So she is assaulted there physically and sexually. She gives the sheriff's deputies of that parish a description of an African-American man, fits the description of Clyde Charles, and based upon testimony, Clyde Charles was convicted, went to jail for 18, 19 years, into the Innocence Project, got involved and used DNA to free him from that case. He was not the suspect, but it turns out that the woman wasn't so far off, because a year later, Clyde's brother, Marlo, was convicted in that case. He was arrested for the actual rape. But you see the difference in the worth. So Cecil was this star running back who, could have helped the SEC powerhouse, but society looked at him differently, as opposed to the guy who's out hitchhiking at 4:30 a.m. and he's one of those guys. Had to be him. Had to be. So these are the things that journalists have been writing about for years. They shouldn't shock you. I think about my trip to Mining, Mississippi, covering a documentarian who had reopened the case of Emmett Till, and how shocking those pictures were that went out in Jet magazine. The allegation was that he was playing checkers on this porch, and the facade was still there the last time I went. Pretty ragged, but it's still there. He was playing checkers on that porch, and supposedly he whistled at Carolyn Bryant, a white woman. Well, of course, that wasn't permitted in Mississippi. So then she tells her husband, and of course they go get Emmett out of the bed, drag him out of the bed, and he ends up in the Tallahassee River, dead. So they take him to court. And guess what happens? Of course, they're acquitted. Not only are they acquitted, after they are acquitted, they go give an interview to Money Magazine and they brag about the murder. But because of double jeopardy, you all know this, they can't retry him for that crime. And I think even if they could, they wouldn't have. But I just mentioned those cases to give you perspective. To give you perspective about each one of them. Think about Cecil Collins, what society thought he was worth. Think about Clyde Charles, what society thought he was worth. Think about Emmett Till, what society thought he was worth. And I think when it comes down to societal and criminal justice, it's how you're viewed. It's all about politics. It's all about social status. Those are the key factors that I find determine and make the wheels of justice really turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. I appreciate those comments very much, and it certainly prompts some questions. I hope some questions and comments from our audience members as well. It raises in my mind the whole question about whether what's driving this gulf, I will call it, between social justice on the one hand and what we see sometimes with criminal justice on the other is racism, or whether instead this has now taken a slightly different form. I'm particularly sensitive to the word racism. I was born in the South and pretty much grew up in the South, although I'm an Army brat, so I like to think I'm a citizen of the world. But certainly I have encountered my share of racism, never directed at me, of course, as you can imagine, because I don't wear the skin color that I have in a way that seems to offend some people. And so when I think about racism, with the Emmett Till case, we have a clear-cut example of racism. I mean, I don't think there's any question that this is the motivation behind the horrendous beating of this young man who did nothing more than other young men do every day and wound up paying a horrific price for it. And of course, the suffering of his family is well documented, as it would be, as you would expect it to be. You know, have his mother send her child off to the South to spend some time with family members, and then to discover that he's been beaten to death for no good reason. Not that there would be many good reasons, but there's nothing that even comes close to justifying what happened to Emmett Till. So in my mind, that's a clear-cut case of racism. My feeling, and I would love to have your comment about this, and it harkens back to what Michael was saying earlier, so I'd like to hear from both of you about. It occurs to me that during my lifetime, which I'm proud to say is longer than either of you, and you should be proud of that as well. During my lifetime, I think that this country has done a much better job of suppressing and tamping down overt racism. It still exists. We see it. We see examples of it. But it's much less common than it was when I was younger. Much less common. That's, I suppose, cause for some celebration. But I don't feel very celebratory about this, because I think we're dealing with a much more insidious problem. I think we're dealing now very often with an implicit bias that leads, as Michael was suggesting, that sometimes leads police officers to take certain actions, not because in their mind they're thinking, oh, I'm dealing with a Black man here, but because they come to those encounters with certain stereotypical views about what it is that they're going to be confronting And that drives their decision making. And I would just like for you all to comment on that if you don't mind, and tell me if you think I'm way off base with that, or is racism much more open and rampant than I'm hoping it is?
I really think that, Geary, I think it depends on where you live and who you're dealing with. I remember coming to San Antonio 16 years ago to report, and I was in Comal County covering a fatality, and there was a sheriff's deputy who walked up to me, and I had my work lanyard hanging around my neck, and he grabbed it and he said, "I thought you were somebody." So to me, that didn't exactly say that, he had a fruit basket back at the office waiting on me. It said that he viewed me in a particular way. When it comes to the criminal justice system, I don't know. It just really depends on where you are. It's really a crapshoot. You would hope that, that things are better than they were. That I believe it is, but they certainly aren't where they need to be. There has been a lot of tough on crime, to the point that I think there is no redemption in trying to, we've locked people away forever. And, there are some crimes that are deserving of that, and there's some crimes that don't. Like, I just, as a personal person who is not affiliated with my company or any of that, I don't believe that all drug charges means that somebody should be locked away for the rest of their life, depending on the amount and what kind of drug we're talking about. I just don't know that a marijuana charge warrants 40, 50 years in prison. I think that space belongs to somebody who has committed like murder or rape or, some kind of crimes against children or the elderly that have caused harm or death. That's just my thought.
Well, certainly I subscribe to what you have just said. And Michael, maybe you could comment on this, because it raises an important point that I had been thinking about before our discussion this evening. One of the things that you see all the time in your practice, of course, is the consequences of a criminal conviction when people are sent to prison. And we are aware, as I suppose many people, but certainly not all, are aware of the sentencing disparities that we have seen. Now, some of this was initiated, no doubt, by the unsuccessful war on drugs that this country has been waging now for many decades. As I say, I think quite unsuccessfully. And because of the sentencing schemes that were erected around that effort to eradicate drug use and drug possession and drug dealing in our country, there's been a disparate impact on people depending upon the kind of drug, which would seem to be fairly harmless to somebody who's not involved with drugs or the drug trade. But can you just briefly summarize for our audience members the ways in which that impact has been very different depending on the community involved and the defendant that you might be representing?
Absolutely. A great point you make is the disparate treatment, the different sentences that individuals get, kind of like Marvin was just saying. My gosh, why are people going to prison for decades for drugs? For instance, you ask a normal citizen on the street, what's the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine? They don't know. They have no idea. Yet the United States Sentencing Commission, in putting together the sentencing guidelines for federal court, the disparity in sentencing in determining a sentence between powder cocaine and crack cocaine is amazing, in that you're getting 100-to-1 difference in some cases, sometimes a little less than that. And the reason it's troubling is that, statistically speaking, the crack cocaine is being used in poor neighborhoods where you have either Black citizens or brown citizens that are using crack cocaine as opposed to white citizens using powder cocaine. Why? Why should there be such a disparate difference in the sentencing? We've been fighting that for a long time to try to get the Sentencing Commission to change that. And what's kind of disturbing is, not to get too much into law school or anything, but the First Step Act came out just a few years ago to try to fix some of these problems. And then just recently, the First Step Act was disavowed with respect to that disparity between powder and crack cocaine. And it's starting to reinforce these concerns where we thought we were getting past, this neighborhood is going to get, a 10, 20, 30 to 1 disparate treatment just because they're using crack instead of powder. And I completely agree with you, Professor Reamey, completely.
Well, I think it's just such a powerful example that that we've been living with now for a long time of the ways in which the criminal justice system can, whether intentionally or not, but certainly can treat similarly situated people in very different ways. So crack cocaine, as you say, which was much more dominant in the Black community than powder cocaine, that drew the big sentence. Well, why? I have to admit that, as a non-drug user, when you say cocaine to me, it's just cocaine. But I do understand, because of working in the criminal justice system, of course, the difference in the two. But the primary difference in the two has nothing to do with the chemical composition. It has everything to do with the communities that are going to be impacted by strict enforcement and harsh long-term prison sentences. And I think when we think about criminal justice and social justice and how they work together, we have to think about it. We have to think about the impact that laws are going to have, and not just assume that everybody in society is going to be impacted exactly the same by the law, because after all, we apply the law the same to everybody. Well, it's true. We applied the law and the sentencing law related to crack cocaine to white people as well as to Black people. But guess what? Most of the people who were being sentenced under those laws were not white people. So you can't ignore the impact that these laws have. We have some questions. We have several questions now from some of our audience members, and I'm thinking we are getting some more. So that's good. Let's see what the audience members want us to talk about. The first one, I guess I should fall on the grenade, metaphorically speaking, and you'll see why in just a moment. We have a question from an audience member who says, have you, I guess meaning any of us, ever found yourself complicit in furthering systemic racism? If so, was there anything you did to correct it? I guess that I would have to say that all of us in society at some point in our professional and personal lives have been in some way, usually unconsciously, I hope, complicit in furthering systemic racism. I think that's just true. Certainly, I don't wake up in the morning and think, well, I'm going to go out and see if I can advance some racist agenda. Not at all, quite the contrary. And yet, like you, Michael, I'm a lawyer. I work in our justice system. And therefore, because I believe that there's a certain amount of systemic racism in the system, by working in it, am I complicit? I suppose, yes, I am complicit. Now, what's the alternative? I could quit, but I'm not sure where I would retreat to professionally or personally that would allow me to feel really good that I was not in any way contributing, even slightly, to some of the racist institutions or racist systems that are in place. And I don't mean by saying that, I know this is a very political topic at the moment. And I don't want us to get sidetracked into this political discussion at all. But I don't want to suggest by this that I think that most people that I associate with or work with are overtly racist. Far from it. Far from it. Not overtly, not consciously, not deliberately. Do things happen? Do they do things that have the effect of perhaps disadvantaging somebody? That largely that disadvantage is based on race. I can't deny that that happens. I mean, I think that I would certainly lose all credibility if I said that. Now, do I think that that means that the country's beyond redemption? Well, that's not the topic for our discussion this evening, but I'll go ahead and since I've already committed panelist suicide, I might as well go ahead and say, no, I don't think that the country's beyond redemption. As I always say, you cannot be a teacher if you're not an optimist. It's just not possible. So I confess I'm an optimist, and I do have a lot of faith in people, and I continue to think that that to the extent that any of us might be complicit in furthering systemic racism, that it doesn't mean that we are doomed to a racist future. I just regret that I don't think I'm going to live long enough to see the end of it. We have another question here from one of the audience members. How do these prejudices in the prosecution attorney's office trickle down to law enforcement officers? Aren't they completely separate functions? I think this is mostly directed at you, Michael, but Marvin, you should weigh in on this as well.
I just did a 3-part special that's about 27 minutes long, and it's called Police and Race. And so I talked to the district attorney's office, and these were some of the questions that I had, because the general public had it. Like, how do you work hand in hand with the police officers and not have some bias with them? How do you accept checks from the police union and not have them, have some merit in some of the decisions that you make? So not to at all be a spokesperson for the district attorney. He has people who do that. But his answer to me was that he had joined an organization and they have stopped taking checks from the police union so that he can create that distance between him and the police union, so he doesn't have that appearance of there being a lack of integrity. And he created a division now to handle what we call officer-involved shootings, which is when the police officer shoots the person because they claim that say that their lives are in danger. So he's created a whole division to handle that, and it may make some officers nervous per the conversation that I've had with him. I think that's about it in a nutshell from the conversation that I had with him about this particular subject.
Yeah, and let me recommend that series to all of our audience members, because I've seen it, and in my opinion, it really is an excellent piece of journalism. And I congratulate you, Marvin. It's an important topic, obviously. Michael, you started off and prompted this question, I think. So what do you think? Is the DA in any given county likely to set the tone for how law enforcement feels about cases and handles them?
Yes is a short answer. And if we all just kind of think back, 10 years, maybe 15, no one wanted to go to Williamson County for a trial, because the DA's office in Williamson County had an office mentality, if you will, of hiding evidence. I mean, that's what happened, like Michael Martin, for instance. But what I meant by trickle down is police officers see prosecutors giving the example. And do you have, like Marvin just talked about, the DA's office here, where, hey, I want to show, absolutely no possibility of bias towards or with the police. I'm not taking money from the usual. You'll recall back in Williamson County, though, the DAs were hiding evidence that they had good reason to believe would exonerate an individual. Well, the police officers see that. I had a case just about 2 years ago before the pandemic. It seems like you have to add a year to everything you say now with that pandemic. Everyone lost here. So, police officer claimed that he was in front of a crack house and saw the client walk up onto the porch of the crack house and do what looked like a drug deal, leave in his car and roll through a stop sign. So the police officer pulled him over and eventually arrested him for possession of narcotics. Yet, when we obtained the GPS records on that squad car, the GPS records put his squad car behind the drug house in the alleyway where there was no way he could have seen what happened on the porch. Everyone knew it was a drug house, and there's no way where he was placed with GPS could he have seen the defendant roll through the stop sign. But even more importantly, all police officers have mobile data terminals. And these mobile data terminals give the police officer the ability to select whether or not their dash cam video is operating during a stop. And so 3 of the 4 officers involved in this case decided to elect a type of saving of that dash cam video that would result in it not being saved like it should have been for 10 years. It was deleted. One officer said because it accidentally started. Another officer said on his dash cam that it was not relevant to the reason for the stop. And the other officer said it wasn't a reasonable deal for the stop period. So the videos we tried to get from those 3 squad cars were black. They were just completely blacked out and gone. The only video that was available was the crime scene investigator detective that came after the stop, who then tested the drugs. And we were trying to show it was an illegal stop. There wasn't rolling through the stop sign the way the officers handled that defendant. Yet the officers had deleted their video in effect and lied about where they were at the deal. So I think that it trickles down from law enforcement to the officer on the street. When the law enforcement see the prosecutors hiding the ball at trial, not providing favorable evidence to the defense, officers start cutting corners on the street when they see that, I think, from their leadership at the DA's office.
I will just add very briefly that my experience working with the police as a legal advisor to a police department in a metropolitan area was that there's probably no greater influence on the actions of officers than the attitude of the police chief and the senior administration. If they take the position and enforce the view that we're going to treat people the same, no matter what their status is, whether they have money or they don't, whether they're of one race or ethnicity or another, that all people are going to be treated properly and misconduct will be addressed swiftly and transparently. That has a tremendous effect on the rank and file. It really does, in my experience. I was kind of amazed. I went to that job not right after law school, a few years after law school, which was just a couple of years after being in the military. And you would think that in the military, I would have seen the same thing, and I did. But actually, it was even more impactful when I saw it happen in the police department where I was working. So my answer, long-winded though it was, is absolutely trickle down makes a huge difference. It really does. I've got another question here from an audience member. Wouldn't the proper response to the 3 cases, I think he's talking about the ones that you mentioned, Michael, then be to advocate for a hard defined punishment for each type of crime that can't be fixed or bent in light of outside considerations such as an individual's merits or faults? Now, you've practiced in both federal and state court, and so we have a very different sentencing scheme depending on where you are now. Less different than it used to be maybe, but still quite different. So on the one hand, you have in federal courts, or did have, a pretty rigid scheme of sentencing guidelines. That was an effort to make things uniform so that people who were charged with the same crime and had the same kinds of punishment factors would get the same treatment. And that's an admirable goal. I think we all agree. Your punishment shouldn't depend on which court you're in. At the same time, it takes away from judges all of the discretion to tailor the punishment or consequence to the crime and, importantly, to the defendant in the case. So where do you come down on this? Do you think we're better off with some sentencing guideline scheme, or do you think we would benefit more from doing what Texas does, which was basically saying, oh yeah, first degree felony, it's 5 to 99 years or life. So, just pick a number in there someplace.
Which, by the way, is my favorite question to get from a jury. What's the difference between 99 years and life? That's just never a good question to get. The federal sentencing guidelines, were mandatory forever until Booker came out a few years ago. Booker and Gall, saying thankfully that they were advisory only, that the court was to look at, Title 18 United States Code, Section 3553A factors, which, we now put sentencing memorandums together. You get letters from family, coaches, teachers, whatnot, attaching to a sentencing memorandum. And judges whom I've spoke to after Booker and after Gall were so relieved that the sentencing guidelines were no longer mandatory, and they had some discretion in the sentences they could hand down. So I completely agree, Professor Reamey, that more discretion with the sentencing authority, I think the better. I wish federal courts had 12 citizens deciding that sentence instead of just someone in a robe, but I'll take 12 citizens in a box deciding a sentence any day of the week with a nice range like 5 to 99 years or life. I agree.
Okay. I've got a kind of pressed for time here, so I want to get in one more question, and I think it's a good one because it certainly deserves some comment from both of you, and it involves the George Floyd case, which of course is still very much on the national consciousness. Do you think the George Floyd murder and trial will be beneficial to the defense in criminal cases? I am a assistant U.S. attorney in New Orleans. We just had a hung jury in an armored truck robbery and shootout jury trial with prosecution, eyewitnesses, and DNA expert testimony. One juror would not vote to convict the defendant. And I gather from the question that it's at least a possibility that this juror who hung up the jury was not satisfied because of the very public display in the George Floyd case. And I would like both of you to just comment, at least briefly, for our audience on the impact of the George Floyd case. Marvin?
So I think that everybody thought that the George Floyd verdict was a turning point, and I don't think it is. I think the George Floyd case was a case that happened in Minnesota. I think that it was covered nationally. I think that it provided some hope for those who were looking for justice, who had seen so many shootings happen across the country. And finally for them, they got a chance to see someone who they believed to be a perpetrator be convicted of murder and sentenced to prison. But that's happening in Minnesota. I don't think at all that that's going to be a duplicate movement that is going to happen across the country. I mean, we can all be hopeful, but I just want to keep it, as the kids say, 100. I just don't think that that's going to be the case. Minnesota stepped up and they convicted an officer in video that was very hard to watch, that was very hard to defeat in court. Minnesota stepped up and they paid $27 million, I believe it was the settlement, civil settlement to the family, even before the criminal trial even happened. But come to San Antonio, October 2018, I believe it was, at 217 Robert Street, Charles Roundtree Jr. was inside of a house that was known to be a drug house, had police problems. He was sitting in there. He was not the intended target. An officer went to that home looking for an assault suspect, passed a witness to get into the house. There's body cam video where he pushes open the door and then the person reacts. So the officer takes out his gun and he starts shooting. He kills Charles Roundtree. That officer has been cleared. That officer is back on the street, and that civil case has not been handled. So if you look at that case, if you look at even what happened with Breonna Taylor's case, they settled it civilly, but criminally, not so much. So George Floyd's case, while it was national, I think it provides some hope, but I don't think it's the turning point that everybody thinks it is.
Michael, what's your take on George Floyd and its impact?
It clearly has not acted as a deterrent so far, nor has the sentence. We still have, white police officers shooting and killing Black citizens. Where it's going to hopefully make a difference is like you were saying, Professor Reamey, the chief of police deciding what type of, committee or panel to put together to make a determination to whether or not to refer charges over to the intake section of the DA's office. And you would hope that there would be more openness by law enforcement to tell the public why they made the decision they did as to whether or not to refer charges over to the DA's office. And then the same with the DA's office for their intake section to say why they made a determination whether or not to refer the case to grand jury. So hopefully it'll make those changes. I agree with Marvin. I don't hold a lot of hope out though.
I don't have any disagreement with what either one of you said. That's also my view, that it was an important case, an important statement that was made in Minnesota, but we shouldn't take it for more than it is. That's perhaps unfortunate. I think the one thing that we all hope is that there will be accountability when police officers act inappropriately, and that happens. And when it happens, we don't want to see those officers shielded. We want them to take the responsibility for their actions. They have a very difficult job. I don't think any of us would deny that. It is a difficult job. And it's hard to get this right all the time. But all of us who work in professions are held to a higher standard of care in all of our work. We are expected to have, and we are licensed in recognition of having a higher level of skill, and that carries with it a higher duty to the public. And so I don't feel particularly sympathetic when an officer misbehaves. I think that's the way that you get true professionalism in policing, is to make everybody aware that there are great privileges that come with this position, but there are great responsibilities as well. And I hope we'll reach that. We are, I'm sorry to say, with more great questions and comments pending, we are out of time for that. But if you have a very brief closing remark that you would like to make, this would be the time to make it. Marvin, anything, final thought?
Okay, I'll keep it tight before I get a hard wrap here. I know.
Thank you.
I know how that is.
Count on a newsman and anchor.
There are very good police officers who work in the city of San Antonio in Bexar County, quality police officers. They're quality law enforcement leaders here in this county, federal, state. I mean, I just cannot believe the level of cooperation that they have here towards getting things done. And I've seen it work in action, and they are to be commended for that. But there are also some officers who don't belong on the force. And I believe that they are trying to work hard to rid themselves of those problems because the citizens are demanding more. They're demanding transparency. They're demanding that video be released from those body cameras. I think the DA's office is making steps toward being, more transparent, even when it comes down to the grand jury process. By law, they can't talk about it, but he is even committed to, releasing a memo to the public about what they tried to do or what they tried to say, so that the public has some clue and doesn't feel like, they've been snookered and he said one thing in public and did another thing in the grand jury. He's also asked his prosecutors, not to lean in, so you don't, that old phrase about the DA and the ham sandwich doesn't come true. So I am hopeful that we are seeing some steps towards change, but we've got a long way to go. And my job is not to make the news; it's just to report it. I'll be there covering.
Michael, any final thoughts?
Just real briefly, I completely agree with what Marvin's thoughts were. There are excellent police officers out there, just as there are excellent prosecutors out there. But there's also folks that need to be taken to task. And I think that discussions like this that you put on well today, Professor Reamey, help the average citizen have some realization going into jury duty, for instance. I think that's where the big change will be, where you have citizens coming in for jury duty who now don't think that just because someone's in a uniform and takes the oath and testifies, that necessarily means that everything they're saying is accurate and beyond reproach. And so I think what I hope comes from all this is we have better awareness from our citizens who come in to do jury duty, and along with what Marvin was saying about more visibility from law enforcement and the DA's office.
Thank you very much to both of you for your participation and for your thoughtful comments and your insight. I wish we could continue this discussion for, half a dozen more hours, because that would be fine with me. We wouldn't begin to touch on all of the issues, or even most of the issues that deserve attention. As you said, I hope that this conversation continues, that this is just another part. I think Marvin's contributions through his journalism help to keep that conversation going. I think to the extent that Michael can talk about the work that he does, why it's important. And I know from having done criminal defense work myself that this is not the position if you want to be the most popular guy in town, but why it's important, and people should understand why it's so important, just as they should understand why it's so important for people like our viewer, who's the Assistant U.S. Attorney, to prosecute these cases in a competent and ethical manner, and for the police to do the job that so many of them do so very well, and to make sure that we do, as you say, root out the people who shouldn't be doing that job. I hope to our audience, all of you have enjoyed our webinar conversation this evening. Our webinar goal was to give the audience an introduction, just an introduction, a taste really, of some of the many perplexing issues that face our society regarding both social justice and criminal justice and the ways in which those overlap. We hope that this discussion was helpful to you in broadening your own perspectives, and that it will prompt further thought and conversation about these important issues. For additional learning together content, including other webinars, podcasts, and book club information, please visit the Lifelong Learning page on the Alumni website. See that on your screen now. I know these webinars during the pandemic especially have been just full of lots of fascinating content, and I have enjoyed them many times, and I hope that you all not only enjoyed our conversation this evening, but that you will continue to enjoy these in the future. So from all of us Tigers on your panel, whether from Grambling State or from Trinity, we wish you a very good evening. And thank you very much for joining us this evening.